What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy, Jack Slack. This episode of the Fights Gone By podcast is brought to you free of integrity, courtesy of the kind warlord behind Acma Mma. It's Monday morning and we got some fights to cover. UFC London took place. I actually watched it afterwards, didn't watch it live, despite being in England and it being on my time, being in my time zone, rather. Yeah, not a bad night of fights by any means. I mean, it was hard to write about beforehand. You know, if you saw me complaining about this, like, there were very few names on this that you could write something interesting about. And there were a lot of debuting fighters, and the problem with debuting fighters, which I found over and over again while doing Prospect Watch, is that on the regionals, the level generally is so low that you can watch dudes just smash their way through and get to the UFC, but it doesn't really tell you an awful lot about their style. You know, look at Sage Northcutt beating the shit out of people on the regionals and then getting to the UFC and we realised, oh god, this guy can't strike at all. You know, countless examples like that, and it makes it very complicated. But yeah, not a bad night of fights. I've got my star ratings here. We'll do these, we'll do the news, and then we'll come back and talk about the fights. So all the way down, out of 5 stars, 5 stars is the max, maybe 6 stars, but we haven't even encountered a 5-star fight yet since I've been doing these. So, as always, get angry, hold on to it through the news, swallow it, and then we'll get back to it, and you can let that bile come up when I explain why I gave the scores I gave. Obviously subjective, all my own opinions, and it's both technical and excitement. Like, if the fight is interesting for one reason, I will rank it higher. If it's devoid of both of those things, it'll rank lower. So Sinofsky versus Godbeer, 2.25. Cajun Johnson versus Stevie Ray, 2. Ankalaev versus Craig, 3.5. Henry versus Duardo, 4. Roberts versus Enkamp, 3. Phillips versus Bird, 3. Edwards versus Sabota, 2.5. Duquesnoy versus Ware, 3. Blachowicz versus Manoa, 3.5. Werdum versus Volkov, 2.75. Right, there we go, that's the scores, and we'll head into the news now. Story number 1, which links in nicely with what we're talking about today. The US government is now monitoring payments between Acma Mma and the UFC's fighters. If you don't know, Acma Mma is owned by Ramzan, whatever his first name is, Kadyrov. Kadyrov is the strongman in charge of Chechnya. Strongman is the term that's used all the time in the media. I have no idea if he's prime minister or president or Shah or whatever, but he is not a pleasant person. Among the many human rights violations he's accused of, one of the main ones is committing a genocide against gay people. This, of course, gets linked to Fabricio Werdum, and every time this comes up, people are like, well, why don't people talk about Khabib? Khabib is always involved with this guy. Frankie Edgar, Chris Weidman, all sorts of people go over, because he, in addition to being a keen homophobe, he is also a big fan of mixed martial arts, and he likes to pay fighters to stand next to him. And he has his own promotion, and he backs his own fighters. And basically, if you are a decent MMA fighter, or if you were an MMA fighter, and you are no longer an MMA fighter, you can make good money thugging in Chechnya for Kadyrov, allegedly. The reason that it's probably a little bit more, not concerning, I mean, I doubt Fabricio Werdum is up for the extermination of gay people, but when you have a guy who regularly uses homophobic slurs, and he's also publicly thanking Kadyrov and wearing Acma Mma t-shirts during these promos, not good really, not a good look. And it's really reflects badly on the UFC for, in the promo segment on this card, Werdum's wearing the Acma Mma t-shirt. It would not have been hard to just say, you can't do that, don't do that. Or we will pay you extra to not do that if Acma Mma is paying you to wear it. And that's the interesting thing about this, because he is clearly happy to sponsor people, pay them money to wear his shit, in a context where they don't wear it in the UFC, on the way to the cage, or in the ring, where most people who would sponsor MMA fighters are apparel companies and things like that, who, once you take away the option of wearing that apparel in the ring, they're not interested anymore. Whereas a guy with all the money in the state can pretty much fund whatever he wants. But if you're interested in Kadyrov, and he is an interesting figure, you should probably be keeping an eye on if you're wanting to know what's going on in the world going forwards. He's worth checking out Kareem Zidane's work. He does excellent work keeping up with this stuff. There's a big link through Ali Abdelaziz, who is a fairly scummy manager, but most of them are. But again, you can do all your own research on this. You can read all about it, but it's certainly interesting to have, just by this guy having a mad interest in MMA like the rest of us do, he's sort of intersected world events with this very niche sport. It's very peculiar. Other news, slightly better news to be honest. Nick Newell returned to the ring, and he won his fight. Nick Newell retired about 2 years ago, and I wrote an article about him then, where I basically just said that Nick Newell, if you don't know who Nick Newell is, sorry, he's a one-handed MMA fighter. I was going to say one-armed, but he has the arm just below the elbow, or above the elbow. Yeah, he has the arm from just beneath the elbow up to his shoulder. But obviously, fighting with one arm is not any sort of advantage, really. I mean, in this article I wrote, we talked about Kyle Maynard and a couple of other. There was another NCAA Division 1 winner who had one leg, and the way that works, quite interestingly, is that while you are at a disadvantage physically, you both Kyle Maynard and this guy with one leg were naturally bigger build than many of the people in their division, so they had a little bit more muscle mass than they would have had if they had a fully able body. That's not to say that's an advantage, but that's a silver lining, I suppose, in terms of competition, where you have to consider all the advantages that you have rather than just looking at everything as a disadvantage. But Nick Newell, I really admired him, mainly because I watched Kyle Maynard's MMA fight, and I'd seen a couple of MMA fights, with amputees in them or things like that. And Kyle Maynard's is the worst because they couldn't get it sanctioned. They couldn't find anyone to fight him. And the guy who did agree to fight him, Kyle Maynard, sorry, I didn't explain, he's missing 4 limbs, all 4. But he was an accomplished wrestler, and he does all sorts of things, like he climbed Kilimanjaro without any prosthetics. Very inspirational person, but he wanted an MMA fight, and this guy who agreed to fight him, very clearly early on, you realised, this guy could just knock him unconscious right now. And he just sort of spent the fight pouring at him and letting him come towards him and circling off and not really doing anything. And I didn't like it at all because it was very visible that he was pitying this guy. You didn't get to see the wonderful stuff that Kyle Maynard can do in spite of his disabilities. You got to see Kyle Maynard being pitied and carried through this fight. And that made me really sad. Maybe it was one of the very few times that I felt really uncomfortable watching fights. I've seen all kinds of horrible mismatches. I've seen people beaten to death, but that one really made me uncomfortable, and I had to stop watching, and look away for a bit. But Nick Newell had one arm. At no point did anyone ever treat him like he had one arm. I mean, he had trouble finding fights early on, but I think he had 13 fights, went 12-1. The one is Justin Gaethje, and Justin Gaethje laid into him like he would anyone else. If you are a good enough fighter that with one arm you can make Justin Gaethje fight a normal fight against you, that's fairly impressive. Nobody ever took stock of Nick Newell and said, "Oh damn, better carry him or find a way of getting him out of here without hurting him too much." All people ever thought when they fought against Nick Newell was, "Shit, this guy's swinging at my head, and now he's taking me down." So Nick Newell really is an inspiration, and he's returned to MMA. He won his match, and he just signed with Ali Abdelaziz, wrapping up our 2 stories nicely. And this is all interesting because he wants a run in the UFC. And Justin Gaethje, absolute boy that he is, came out and said, yeah, he absolutely deserves a run in the UFC. And in fairness, there have been much worse fighters than Nick Newell made it to the UFC. The problem is that it is a massive image issue if the UFC has this guy with one arm fighting, and this will be the first time that anyone's seen him, really, unless they follow MMA and are hardcore fans. Nobody who watches the UFC casually will have seen him. If he comes in and he loses badly, that's why the hell did you let this guy with one arm fight? Fortunately, Ali Abdelaziz is pretty good at getting guys into the UFC, which will make this very interesting in the coming weeks and months. Supposedly, Ali doesn't work with Bellator at all, so there's no chance of getting him into the B show, but clearly the highest, the most professional freak show part of MMA, I would say Bellator is. But really, if you're going with Abdelaziz, he seems to be putting it all on getting into the UFC. So good for Nick Newell, keep an eye on that, and if you haven't ever seen him fight before, go watch it, because he's slick on the ground, and brave on the feet, so, you know. Other news, Arlovsky versus Tuivasa is confirmed. You know what they want here. Cyril Asker was a fairly obvious gimme. He'd had 2 knockouts in his last 4 fights, 2 knockout losses, and they put him in against Tai Tuivasa. But the reason that this really makes me uncomfortable is that Arlovsky shouldn't be getting booked to fight anymore, him and Overeem, and just this very week, a lad called David Whittam, a boxer, died up in Canada after 10 months in a coma following his last fight, and he'd been knocked out 11 times in total in his career. And this is the thing, like, we know getting knocked out multiple times increases your chance of really bad later life, and also death in the ring. There seems to be this denial amongst fans. Like, whenever I bring this up, there's always people going, well, he's winning fights, and how many knockout losses is too many knockout losses? And I don't know if there's a magic number, but I would say if you have let a guy into the ring or cage with double-digit knockout losses, you are a fucking joke as a commission and as a company. Yeah, this poor lad, David Whittam, died just the other day. Very similar to Tim Hague's situation. Tim Hague suffered numerous knockout losses, some of them back-to-back. This lad had some back-to-back ones. But if you think about Andrei Arlovsky, he had 4 knockout losses back-to-back a little while ago, and they were hiding him from proper commissions until he went the distance with Marcin Tybura, losing that one and getting beat up in the process. And he picked up a win, and now they've just taken him back to Vegas because he had a win, and they could say, well, he won a fight. But the thing is, like, I cannot understand people who then go, well, he's on a 2-fight winning streak. Doesn't matter. Tim Hague beat Caleb Starnes, which was the best name on his record for a very long time, just a few months before he died. But it was sandwiched in between a load of KO losses. You know, Andrei Arlovsky and Alistair Overeem are good enough fighters that they could beat the majority of fighters in the world even if you cut off one of their arms. They're 260-pound dudes who can actually fight. Being competitive doesn't stop you being a liability. Anyone with any sense can see this. Ferdy Pacheco, very famously, Ali's personal doctor, left their camp when he realised that Ali was exhibiting the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and they were still having Ali fight. And Ali was fighting world champions. You know, his last 4 fights were against world champions. He never really fought anyone lower. And he won and lost, but he was still exhibiting these symptoms, you know? If you're one of the best ever, or, you know, one of the best in the world at something, when you're getting fucked up, you're still going to be pretty good at it compared to everyone else. So, absolute joke that Arlovsky's getting licensed again. Write to your congressman, tweet Dana White. I'll probably write about it in the coming weeks. And then the other sad news, Bobby Knuckles, Robert Whittaker, dropped out of the Commonwealth Games where he'd qualified to compete as a wrestler. Pretty much unheard of. A guy who had no childhood in the sport, or, you know, teens or whatever in wrestling, comes into wrestling through MMA and gets onto the Commonwealth team, which was an amazing story. Would have been great for the UFC publicity-wise, but Whittaker's statement basically said, yeah, the UFC pressured me not to do this. They were going to strip me of the title. Sad, but equally you can also understand where the UFC are coming from. You know, it's always been a very grey area because the UFC will let you compete in Abu Dhabi, you know, no-gi grappling, or take a super fight at like Polaris or something, but they won't let you box because that's very clearly going to be damaging your brain. It's a strange place where they have to be careful what they allow guys to do without enforcing their desire to keep their athletes from getting damaged while under contract. Right, let's talk about these fights then. We'll go bottom to top. Sinofsky versus Godbeer. This was what I called on Twitter what a fight looks like if there's 0 feints, because every time either man stepped in, it was fully committed, you knew they were stepping in, and they ate the other guy's punch as they stepped in. So whoever started stepping first immediately got countered, and it never changed. Lots of charges into the clinch. Sosnovsky can't strike for shit. You know, he's throwing these right-hand leads wildly. But Sosnovsky, cool grappler. He kept hitting these sacrifice trips and ending up on top. He did a nice weave pass on Godbeer when Godbeer put in the knee shield. But Godbeer was also doing a decent job sprawling on the actual shots, looking for anaconda chokes, things like that. Second round, Sosnovsky hits the same sacrifice trip, jumps on a leg from guard, looking for a leg lock, immediately loses it. Ken Shamrock UFC 1 stuff. Godbeer gets on top of him as a result. Then Godbeer fell off him and got a knee cut pass. They ended up in Sosnovsky's guard, and Sosnovsky put in the grapevines and started attacking the Kimura, which was some straight Neil Melanson stuff. Almost swept him because Godbeer was going down on his side to try and stop him from pulling the arm out. But they ended up getting restarted on the feet, and as soon as they stepped in, again, no feints, no fakes, no nothing. Godbeer steps in legit. Sosnovsky hits him with the right hand as he's stepping in. Godbeer gets rocked, shoots, gets guillotined and swept to mount, and then gives up his back, and Sosnovsky chokes him. My main summary of this fight on my notes was entertaining heavyweight fight, low technical level, but fun enough. And I gave it 2.5 stars. Again, 4 stars is must-watch territory. 3 stars is if you're a fan of, a real fan of fights. This one you should probably watch from that card too. And anything below 3, we're saying not really watching even for the hardcore fan. But 2.5, not bad. If you've watched all the other good stuff on the card, come watch this. If you're still hankering for something to watch, that is. Cajun Johnson versus Stevie Ray. My notes say round 1, nothing. Round 2. And fair play, Jimmy Doolan, who's a great corner man, was in Stevie Ray's corner. And he immediately said, nothing happened that round. So fair enough, let your man have it honestly. Round 2 picked up quite a lot. There was a nice fake low-line sidekick from Kajan. Is it Kajan? Yeah, Kajan Johnson. And then he did the fake low-line sidekick and stepped in with a 1-2. It was a bit windmilly the way he did it, but he caught Ray perfectly. And that's the nice thing about the low-line sidekick. It is a gliding step in. You can do it with or without the kick. It's just stepping. You're basically stepping onto where the opponent's knee is, or you can opt to not step on their knee and step on the mat instead. However, that does backfire for a fighter later in the card. But yes, he stunned Stevie Ray nicely off that. He ran in on Stevie Ray, and Ray actually picked up a guillotine off the fence. Came up on a front headlock, and Kajan Johnson hit a nice sucker drag, which is where you come out of the front headlock and you basically arm drag them while popping your head out, and went to Ray's back along the fence. Very nice stuff. And then towards the end of round 2, you saw Stevie Ray cutting the cage well and landing good low kicks. And then in the third round, he's coming forward and he's landing good 1-2s. If I had one thing I'd say that I'd like to, that might have changed the performance for Stevie Ray, obviously, Captain Hindsight over here, but he was throwing 1-2s and he was landing nicely along the fence. He was using his pressure to get him into position where he couldn't run. And he'd come in with the 1-2, crack him in the head, did it twice in a row, and then the third time he stepped in for the 1-2 and Kajan Johnson just dropped on his hips. And that's something... But he knew the straight was coming to his head. He didn't have to worry about anything else. Maybe an uppercut or a knee or something like that. He knew Ray was committing to trying to blast his head off so he could duck under it. And it really was sort of letting him off the hook. He was in bad way when he ducked in on Ray's hips as he came in. I would have liked to see Stevie Ray using the 1-2 and maybe hitting the body more with the right with the straight. Just because it's a nice way to mix it up. Hit the chest, because if you hit the chest, that's not like targeting the body, it's still almost punching the head, but you have that nice ramrod in their chest if they do try and duck in on you. But I thought his work in the third round was considerably better. Some interesting guard work, butterfly guard and the pyramid, which is basically almost the triangle. It's where you've got one leg high across the back and the shoulders with the overhook and the other knee inside the opponent's arm. So you're basically just trying to get that wrist and kick your leg through. But yeah, not bad. Stevie Ray did seem to stun himself in the last seconds with a clash of heads as he was pursuing a takedown, which, always dangerous. The more you try and get into the kitchen, the more chance you have of clashing heads as the other dude ducks. But I thought Stevie Ray could have edged it, but then, when you're going round by round scoring and nothing happens in the first round, it's very difficult to score it cleanly for one man or the other. I gave it 2 stars because it had some entertaining moments, but the first round was not worth watching at all. And, it had some action, but I wouldn't have called it must-watch TV. I wouldn't have called it even a particularly good fight. I'd have called it a fairly mundane fight with some good moments. Also enjoyed Kajan Johnson preaching in the aftermath. You don't have a right to boo. No, gave money to be here. Definitely do. Ankalaev versus Craig. I'm going to say right now, I was on the side where I was like, well, they're putting this heavy-handed Russian lad, who's very good on the top, on the ground, and also pretty heavy-handed on the feet, in against Paul Craig, who's shown that he, firstly, can't box for toffee, and secondly, plays a lot on the bottom, and it has chin issues, very obvious chin issues. But after the fight went exactly the way we all expected for 14 and a half minutes. Paul Craig, he won so much of my respect in this fight, and his post-fight speech, he seemed really down to earth too, if you could understand what the fuck he was saying. But I've spent enough time in Scotland to take up the language. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. Craig was kicking, and he always has had a decent kicking game. It's just that if you aren't going to punch at all, people know exactly what you're going to do. The kicks become less effective. The Dutch proved this back in like the 80s. If you're punching first and then kicking, your kicks have more chance of sneaking in, and your punches have more chance of sneaking in if you set up your kicks. It just goes back and forward. If you take away one weapon, you would, as John Danaher said, be ignoring 50% of the body. But Ankalaev took it to him early, body kicked him, sent him to the fence. Craig was spinning and falling over himself at points in this fight, shooting these takedowns that weren't really working. What I did like from Paul Craig on the ground, he's very strong on the ground, like technical for a big man like that. But I was watching him when he was getting put in bad positions, when Ankalaev was passing and getting to his side. He was constantly fighting off the crossface. When he was face down in the turtle, he was constantly, if Ankalaev put an arm in to search for a choke, Craig would grab it and try and push it to the mat and work out from it. They always say you shouldn't give up your hands when you're going for front headlocks and chokes and things like that. You've got to keep them short. Ankalaev was a strong dude, though, because there were points when he came up from the knees and Craig was working his way up to standing to sprawl on him. And from his knees, he hoisted Craig onto his shoulder and turned him over and finished the double. It was incredible. But, most of it was just Craig was getting beat up on the feet. When they went to the mat, Craig ended up on the bottom and got his guard passed, and he wasn't really having any effect with his well-respected guard. Third round, Ankalaev lands a high kick. I got Craig floundering, desperate shot along fence. Ankalaev straightening the dance, but Craig's always controlling a wrist. Falls over on a spinning elbow coming off the fence, still seemed very dazed. Ankalaev takes him down again, or defender takedown. It's darsing him, punching him under the armpit with the Darce hand, which I really like. And then just in the last seconds, Paul Craig, if you watch the replay, like he just throws it up. It's not a really clever setup or anything. But if you watch the replay, he waits for the punch, and when he feels it on his face, he throws the triangle up. I'd had doubts about this guy's chin. I think it's fair to have doubts about this guy's chin, but he's clearly tough enough that he can go, right, I'm going to wait until I take that punch on the face and then I'll move. And this is what I was watching with Sakuraba in the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. The second lecture is now up on that for Patreon boys, by the way. But I was watching the Ricardo Arona fight, which is the reason I haven't ever watched that event in full since, because I hate that fight. It's really not a nice fight. It's dark. But Sakuraba, if you watch him fight Arona or anyone else, he's willing to take a beating and he'll wait for you to punch him in the head so that he can time something. Arona's got a front headlock and is kneeing him in the head. Sakuraba is waiting on the knee. You can watch him getting ready, and then when the knee lands, he immediately hits a peek out, and Arona falls off him because he just times it at the right moment. Really cool, but also you can't be relying on it too much because, like Sakuraba, you just take a beating. Like the Zel Galasic knee bar, he takes 100 punches to the face until he feels the time is right to take the leg. So I gave this 3.5 stars. I mean, it was, there were many things that would have pushed it into the 4-star criteria, must watch. 3.5 stars and above, really, if you're a fight fan, you're going to love that fight. Or enjoy it, at least. The finish, we all went mental in the aftermath. The finish was a lot better than most of the fight, but it was still a good technical fight for the most part. And you saw the potential of Ankalaev. He came in as the Russian superstar and he showed off what he could do. But you also saw that Craig is tougher than we give him credit for. And, perhaps has a future in the UFC. A loss here probably would have seen him cut. But actually, having said that, it's the light heavyweight division. There's no one for anyone to fight, so maybe not. But, you saw that he's working on stuff, and he seems to have a good attitude about it from watching the post-fight speeches. or interview or whatever it is. Henry versus Duardo. People have been telling me about Duardo all week. I was excited about this. Sorry, Duardo. Yeah, I thought this was an amazing performance. I gave this the highest rating on the card. It's a 4-star because it's a short, quick finish. It's a technical one. I think it's a must-watch. Without having seen much of Duardo, I knew that he was a quick lad. And he was moving well right from the start. Henry came out and he feints the jab again, and then double jabs into a right hand and knocks him down. Goes for the guillotine. Duardo's rolling out, keeps rolling with it, and Henry stays on it, keeps going for it, ends up walking into a mount with it, having changed it to a high elbow and locked it all up, standing. And I think Duardo went out. I don't remember if he tapped or not, but it was an excellent finish, and it was an excellent start to the fight too. Like, if you've got a guy like that, or Dan Hooker against Mark Jacasey is another great example. But if you've got a guy who's waiting on a hair trigger, seems like he's waiting for anything you do, because I think he caught a couple of kicks. Like, straight off the bat, Henry threw some kicks and they got caught. But if you've got a guy like that who's waiting on the hair trigger, you've got to get them to respect the feints. And one way to do that is you feint, and then when you go, you've got to go. You've got to throw something, you've got to try and take their head off, basically. You've got to get them to respect the feint. If you feint and then you throw a half-assed jab, that's just taking pressure off them. They're getting to know what it looks like when you're throwing feints and what it looks like when you're throwing legit stuff. They're adjusting. They're growing into the fight. That feeling out period is something that you can really take advantage of against someone who's going to be dangerous on the counter. And if you can catch them cold and finish them early, that's always good too. So I thought that was a terrific fight. I don't know very much about Daniel Henry at all, but I was very impressed. Danny Roberts versus Oliver Enkamp. This was an interesting one because Danny Roberts, he's a decent boxer, but he's got a lot of flaws in that game. Watching him against Mike Perry, I was watching him make all kinds of defensive overcommitments and get out of position and get cracked with these big bombs by a bigger hitter. But Oliver Enkamp is a guy who I think has a lot of potential, but is still sort of growing into who he is. He's kind of like Wonder Boy, but without all the great bits. He's brother of Jesse Enkamp, who's a cool guy. We get along well. Karate by Jesse, great blog. And Jesse's more into the sporting side of karate and the traditional side of karate. And Oliver is obviously an MMA fighter. I saw Oliver's first fight, I believe it was against Nordin Taleb, and he had flashes of good stuff, but he was also letting himself down with his ring positioning. He was putting himself on the fence a lot. He was putting himself in positions where the fleeting footwork isn't going to work as well. And then he had all the nice kicks, but he didn't have a stiff, straight left or right. If you're going to play that sort of distance fighting karate counter game, you've got to have that reverse punch, the left or the rear straight, normally from down by the chest or whatever, but that punch is what punishes people for stepping in on you or chasing you, and he doesn't really show it enough. But in this fight, he was showing the low line side kick, which is a great thing to build off. And we talk about like guys stamping it in and how that doesn't get the opponent, that gets the opponent to run a mile. Like Yair Rodriguez, he tries to throw combinations off it, and they don't work because as soon as he raises his knee to his chest, the opponent runs. But then I compare that with Groovy Lando Venata. He just steps on their lead leg. But you can get too far the other way because Enkamp's just sort of like, he's gently stepping on the lead leg, and it happened twice. Roberts just stepped in, braced the knee for the impact on the floor, and hammered him while he was on one leg, with the left straight, I believe. And it happened twice. Knocked him down the first time and knocked him out the second time. If you get caught on one leg, it's exactly the same as if you get caught on one leg round kicking or front kicking or high kicking or whatever. Getting caught on one leg and punched in the face, firstly, you're going to get knocked off balance anyway because you're going to get moved from on top of your foot to behind your foot. But secondly, you don't have a lot of control over your upper body as you do when you're on 2 feet. You aren't going to be able to instinctively roll with the punch, take the force of it. You're just locked in place, taking the full brunt of the blow. So I gave that 3 stars. I mean, if you're a fight fan, you're going to enjoy that, but it wasn't like a remarkable fight. Not a lot happened. It was an interesting finish, and I think it's an interesting finish because you see guys struggling so much with the low-line sidekick today. I think it's important to realise that it's not a be-all and end-all. There's nothing in this game that, if you do it, the guy can't come up with something to deal with it. There's always things that if you're not doing this, it'll go wrong. If they start doing this, it'll go wrong. It's not an arms race, it's chess. We're not all trying to develop the one technique that will win all the time. We've got a balance between them. Phillips versus Bird. I thought this was a decent fight. I gave it 3 stars. Well, a decent performance rather than a decent fight. The guy took him down. Bird took him down, sorry. Looked for a guillotine along the fence, which I really like. If you watched Darion Caldwell's last fight, defending his Bellator title. What is he, featherweight, bantamweight? Can't remember. But he defended his Bellator title, took the guy down with an underhook. I think it was a knee tap or something like that along the fence. And he kept the underhook, and he snapped up the guillotine while moving into a smash pass, crossing the opponent's legs over them. And he got the guillotine from there and finished it, which was really nice. And Bird did a similar sort of thing, looking for the guillotine on the pass. Nice elbows and control. Grapevines from Mount, not really risking too much. You can't sit up as fully and get as much power if you're grapevining, but you can still do something, and you're holding them in this position where, unless you're Kimbo and Dada absolutely doing nothing and breathing really hard, the referee's not going to stand you up. Though there were some questionable stand-ups the other night. Like, someone got back to 3/4 guard, and they were like, oh, well, that's it, locked up now, stand up. And you're like, no, there's a difference between having the person's foot stuffed and being halfway to passing, and being locked in full guard. But what I did like in this fight, Clay Guida, broke Rafael Dos Anjos with his shoulder strikes. Actually broke his jaw with a punch and then shoulder striked him, and I think, didn't Dos Anjos tap or something like that? But we joked about shoulder strikes for years after that. But the shoulder strikes in this were good. He was from Mount, and he's like posted on his hands in skydiver sort of position, and then he just goes wham 3 times. It was gorgeous, and the guy looked really confused by it. Nick Diaz used a couple of really nice shoulder strikes against some Japanese can he fought years ago too. But Phillips tries to work his way up along the fence. Bird gets the back. Bird gets the choke. It looked like it was over sort of the chin, but if you squeeze hard enough, everything's the neck. And Bird gets up and does a cool spinneroonie. So I gave it 3 stars because, good finish, good performance. Don't really know if Phillips or Bird is a very high-level fighter, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. Edwards versus Sabota was decent, I'd say. Edwards, I forget that he's a pretty crisp striker, because he had a couple of fights where he was almost going to the wrestling to try and show that he'd worked on his wrestling a lot. He's a decent all-rounder. Like, I could see him maybe in a few years being like a top contender, one of the UK's best contenders. He did well from Sabota's guard, even though Sabota's a very high-level black belt. Sabota actually went for he kept going for the Kimura from half guard, and Edwards in the first round dug his head into the chest of Sabota. He put his head inside the figure 4, basically. If you get your head in, it's sort of, well, you can't Kimura someone over their head, basically, but and finish it at least. But then the next time he did it, Sabota just stepped over and started coming up on the armbar, and his head was so low that he started coming up on the back, and Edwards had to tripod up and shake him down, and then he was on the arm for ages, like trying to decide what to do. It was a really cool little sequence. Dan Hardy pointed it out plenty in the fight, but I'm sure you noticed Sabota went from being quite confident on the feet to, when he got clipped by that left hand, he was sort of pulling his head away. So he'd jab and, where you want to jab and take your hand off like it's a hot stove, he was jabbing and pulling his head wildly back like his head had touched something hot. It was interesting. And then the stoppage came just because it seemed like Sabota was knackered, and he got that far wrist trap. I think it was from half guard. Got caught behind his back, but he went to the turtle and just got pounded out. And it was 1 second left, the stoppage. I mean, I enjoyed it. It was very slow in some places, but I gave it 2.75. Not a must-watch by any means, but I'd make it one of the later fights that you watch if you're going to watch the whole card. If you're prioritising, it's not particularly high. Duquesnoy versus Ware. This is always interesting. Duquesnoy is the analyst's favourite. If you hear Heavy Hands, Pat and Connor are always in love with Duquesnoy. And Dan Hardy was also in love with Duquesnoy on commentary. And I can see why. He's very interesting. Firstly, the counter elbows are gorgeous, and he has brutal low kicks. Though he threw like 100 or something, and Ware took a lot of them, didn't check any of them, but he seemed fine. So, Ware is a tough dude, but I like the way he changes stances. I like the way that he has that weird, almost hunchback stance, but he's always down behind one shoulder or the other. which is pretty cool. I mean, he gets hit a fair bit. There was very early on, he got his left eye, was it, marked up? And then as soon as it was starting to swell, he backed off a little bit in the first round. And then he stepped in to attack, and Ware punched him on the counter square in the same spot on the eye. So Ware must have noticed that. But basically the story of the fight was Duquesnoy was doing well with the kicks on the end of the combinations. Ware was doing better with just his hands, doing nice infighting combinations. Uppercut into the left hook, uppercut and then left hook to the body, right hand to the body, left hook upstairs, things like that. And he was just tapping them off, combinations like that. And yeah, I think it depends whether you have like a Thai mindset towards scoring or a boxing mindset towards scoring. Because, in Muay Thai, famously they'll score the kicks much higher than the punches, and elbows and knees higher than everything. but Duquesnoy was missing most of his elbows. I don't think I saw him connect any really good clean ones. But yeah, decent fight. I mean, people got angry about the decision, but I could have seen either man winning it. It was close stuff. I gave it 3 stars. I would say decent enough. Not like an all-time classic, not going to be remembered for very long. It'll be one where we come back to it in a few years, or if I'm ever writing about something about Duquesnoy or Ware getting towards a title shot and I go back through their fights, I'll go, oh yeah, that was surprisingly good. Blachowicz versus Mma, I probably offended people by giving it 3.75 instead of 4. It was an exciting fight. It was a bit of a barn burner. People getting wobbled left and right. I was surprised by... I was surprised by Blachowicz because he looked a little bit Gustafsson-esque, actually. He was, painting him with the jab, just tapping with it, hooking off the jab. I'd seen him against Gustafsson, and he looked basic as anything. He was wearing the sprawl-style shorts, and he was just swinging these overhands. And Gustafsson seemed troubled by it because he was doing it every time he stepped in, but it looked like someone out of a different age of MMA. And then here, he looked more like Gustafsson, which was cool. If there's someone in the light heavyweight division you want to copy on the feet, Gustafsson's a good start. Fucking epidemic of these rear hand uppercuts. Yeah, it would have been right, but rear hand uppercuts coming from behind fighters and using it as a long range weapon, and it hacks me right off. But everyone's doing it. I mean, Gustafsson's made a career of it. Blachowicz was doing it here. I think Mma did it a couple of points. Volkov did it in the main event. And Ware definitely did it, and I'm watching it going, God, that's awful, stop doing that. But guys are getting away with it. But Jimmy Manoa comes out in his Bill Superfoot Manoa. Did you see that? He was throwing up these hook kicks and round kicks like karate style with his lead leg. I'm going, that's really cool, Jimmy. I don't know how well it gels with the rest of your style, but it's definitely very cool. Second round, I thought Manoa did very well pressuring towards the fence. It was in the third round that he sort of had to let off the pressure and was getting hurt more. But really, that's what Manoa's been doing well lately. He's been moving guys towards the fence, taking away their movement, and then hitting them as they circle or just advancing on them as they're stuck there. If you swing back at him from the fence, you should be losing most of those exchanges. Blachowicz won a few of them, quite importantly. But yeah, great fight, I thought. State of the light heavyweight division is still pretty janky, but compared to their first fight, I mean, God, I was so skeptical going into this. But they put on a little crackerjack contest. I was very pleased. Wouldn't say it's must watch, but if you are catching up on the event, probably high on your list to watch. And then Werdum versus Volkov, I gave 2.75. I might have been a bit harsh on this. I think it's because it dragged on a little bit and it was slow in places. And Werdum had some strange choices where he both of them actually, just got to positions and didn't really do anything with it. There was a long period where Werdum was in Volkov's guard doing nothing, and then there was a really weird period just before the knockout where Volkov got into Werdum's guard and Werdum held his wrists, and then they just stared at each other and Volkov was like, let me stand up, and the ref was like, oh, okay. But yeah, weird enough fight. Werdum took him down immediately, which was pretty cool. Werdum was using a nice single leg, and then if he couldn't get it, he'd dive under and pull him on top for the deep half guard. And the deep half guard worked really well in this fight. He came up on sweeps a couple of times, and I think he almost took the back twice and pretty much did take the back once. He used the leg lever, which was nice. He entered the deep half guard at one point while pushing Volkov's chin upwards with the hand that was inside. that's the hand that typically you want to like defend from kimuras or underhooks and things like that. So a lot of guys will tuck it under the leg. A lot of guys will just clasp their arms around the single leg, like as tight as they can. But he was pushing Volkov up by the face, which was really interesting. The leg lever to the back, which was gorgeous. He extended the leg, made a lever out of it, and then he put his right ankle in as a hook and pushed Volkov away and took his back. That was gorgeous. This guy's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is legit world class. We say it all the time, but I've always liked that about him. He did it against Travis Brown too. Anytime he's in trouble, he just pulls them on top into like deep half, and he'll start spinning out the back door. And the deep half is a great position in MMA. It's still really underrated. Guys used to be like, well, if you go into deep half, both your arms are occupied and they can punch you in the head. But you've got the guy's whole weight on top of you. The idea is that you're not supposed to be staying in place underneath him. You're supposed to be moving forward and back, working out where his balance isn't or where he isn't basing. And the idea is that if you keep them moving, their hands are on the mat and not on you. Or rather, you're not getting these hands. But the end came like the other Werdum knockout. He waded in, throwing 1-2s, because that's his defense has always been, if you punch him, he'll punch back with the 1-2 and try and overwhelm you and get you to not trade with him. And a lot of guys shell up. Like, he put the pace on Tabura just a few months ago. Travis Brown is an amazing example. Like, if he puts the pace on you, it's very basic and herky-jerky, and there's lots of flaws in his actual technique. But by keeping in your face and hitting you lots and keeping your head down, he can make you cover up and sort of emotionally collapse, especially in the division of heavyweights. Because the one thing you can say about Werdum is that while he is a 240-pound man, a legitimate heavyweight, he can take a licking and keep on ticking. He won't object to getting hurt a bit, and then he'll come back and do something later. Most heavyweights, and this is a generalization, but you will notice it in the heavyweight division, a lot of them hate being on the back foot. It's like, if I can't get my knockout early, oh dear, I'm going to have a horrible night. And I'll lay down and give up. Werdum, very much not that sort of fighter. But Volkov was doing well with straights, very long uppercuts. I hate them so much. But then he is a gigantic dude. But it was like a 1-2 or something like that. Werdum flurried back and just got caught in an exchange. Volkov was picking him off with clean counters in the exchange. He went down, sitting to his back almost like he always does when he's in trouble, or even he'll fake being hurt and do it. But the first punch that came in after that just put him stiff. It was bad. And it didn't even look that hard. But, when you're 6'8", 6'9", heavyweight, most of the stuff you do is hard, even if you don't mean to. Important fight for the future of the division. Volkov passed, Werdum was becoming a litmus test. Like, if you couldn't get past him, you needed more seasoning. And I think that's what happened with Tabura, If you're not ready for this man to come at you swinging like an octopus and trying to overwhelm you, get back in the gym, try again in another year. But Volkov got past him and he looked impressive. Landed a couple of nice intercepting knees to the body, like he did on Roy Nelson. Good on Volkov. At least we got a nice, interesting, upcoming prospect in the heavyweight division who actually got past one of the old men. And Stipe wants him in Russia. Isn't he fucking awesome? Anyway, let's do some questions. Hi, Jack. I'm incredibly grateful for your podcast and your excellent writing. Please keep up the fine work. Context for the question. I'm a manual osteopath and a strength and nutrition coach. I've competed in grappling and Muay Thai and have long wondered about the following. It seems that most of the voices in the MMA community treat fighters as a relatively known quantity for most of their career. When they start to slide, we acknowledge it. It seems to me that deterioration is apparent before the twilight of a career, though. I see this most in strength and maybe punching power. Fighters that are known for strength or punching power, or both, seem to lose these qualities over time. For example, Cyborg hit Holm and Kunitskaya with hard overhands, but how do we know that they had the same pop they did 8 years ago? She was temporarily outmuscled by both of these opponents, which would have seemed absurd before. Are we really to believe that everyone else is suddenly just as strong as Cyborg, or is it that a decade of really hard weight cuts have taken their toll and she is less muscular and powerful now? Another question, Johny Hendricks has nailed people with his previously vaunted left hand in recent years, but it just doesn't carry the same power that it did before. Is it really that people are taking it better now, or somehow more likely that Johnny's hard cuts have had the same effect? I think the strength and power can both wane over the course of a career for a few reasons. Wear and tear, hard cuts, eating into muscle, as a hard diet will reduce muscle mass in fairly equal proportion to fat. Over coaching and training to change technique after trying to change technique after throwing after 15 years of throwing the punch the same way, and so forth. Your thoughts? It seems obvious that this must happen, but it isn't really acknowledged. We tend to just act like a fighter's strength and punching power are stable commodities until they retire. I don't think so. Again, I love your work and I've learned a lot by listening. Thanks, Connor. I think it's interesting because, old-time fighters insist that power is the last thing to go. But I think there's power and there's power. If you've got good mechanics you can hit hard when you plant your feet, move your body weight, do everything perfect, and you're hitting hard. A lot of the guys who hit hard hit ungodly hard. Like Rumble Johnson. That's not punching power that's going to be taught to someone. And he doesn't do it tight and technical. He'll often load up behind him for days and stuff like that. I think there's, I always talk about Archie Moore and George Foreman, because I believe that they mastered like old man fighting. And Archie Moore's big belief was that you need power more as you grow older, or rather you need to be able to hit hard. And he proved that. He was knocking out dudes when he was 127 years old and dyeing his hair with boot polish. But... And his student George Foreman, George Foreman specifically had Archie in his corner through his 90s comeback. And Foreman definitely showed that power is definitely one of the most important things for an older fighter. But equally, a lot of power is the ability to move explosively and generate force quickly. And that is something that definitely atrophies with age. If you watch George Foreman, he's not like... I doubt he would have ever done amazingly in like vertical jump or any of those traditional tests of what sporting folk call power, ability to generate full body contraction fast or whatever it is. But you're definitely not going to find anyone who hits harder than him. So I don't know if power, the scientific term, and power in hitting are as closely linked as we always assume they are. But I think you brought up some interesting examples. Johny Hendricks is a guy who has not only been ravaged by cuts, but I think, without slandering him, he had a very bad drop-off after USADA came in. A lot of dudes did, but he did. The other thing was that he only really knocked out a few guys before he got his big push, and it was sort of like, because he came out of nowhere, that became his identity for us. But he'd been grinding out decisions in the UFC before that. Yeah, 8 wins out of 26 were knockouts. I mean, he currently hasn't knocked anyone out since Martin Kampmann at UFC 154 back in 2012. But if you remember, it was like the Fitch fight. Well, the Fitch fight really put him on the map. That was 2011. But the Fitch fight and the Kampmann fight, with the Josh Koscheck split decision in between, those were the ones that really got him touted as the massive puncher. But otherwise, it's like Charlie Brenneman, not a tremendously durable fighter. Amir Sadolla, he shocked him in like his professional debut or whatever it was. And TJ Wilderberger. There's not a lot of big stoppages in there. The thing about that I always remember about Johny Hendricks is that or rather when I watch Johny Hendricks footage, I always notice, is that he used to be able to move across the floor very, very quickly. And he seemed to have lost a lot of that ability to get in quick. Because he was never like a crafty fighter. He was just quick at getting in with these... stumpy little arms. He got in much quicker than people expected him to. So I think that is probably a loss of explosivity or power. So whether it's the weight cuts or the drug testing or age, he's taken some beatings. And I'm sure some of that has effect on it too. With Cyborg, and with everyone, in everything, in every combat sport, you are fighting one opponent at a time 3 times a year tops. It's very, every instance is subjective. You can look slow or fast based on how slow or fast the opponent is. You can look powerful or weak depending on how durable or hard-hitting the opponent is. You're always just one of... it's like a binary thing, You're either the fast one or the slow one in the matchup. But, for a lot of her career, Cyborg was fighting really bad opposition. They were bringing up 125ers to fight her. And a lot of the Cyborg show has just been like, let's put Cyborg in with someone we know she can knock out. Kunitskaya, we all expected her to get mauled, but yeah, I was surprised at how she outmuscled her in the clinch. Holly Holm, we've always known Holly Holm is good in the clinch because that's what she does when she runs out of ideas, but she doesn't have any ideas in the clinch. Like, if she had good strikes from the clinch or some nice trips or something, she would be a real force to be reckoned with. She could beat people like Jermaine Duardo and Cyborg, but all she has is her boxing, and then when her boxing fails, she grabs a hold and does nothing. But yeah, I don't know Cyborg's pop, whether it's diminished over the years or what, but I'll be interested to see how it goes forward, whether she is losing a step or something. I mean, she's looked technically sharper than I've seen her in her last few fights. Against Holm, I thought she looked the best I'd ever seen her. I felt like Holm was just a much better fighter than anyone Cyborg had fought. It's one thing knocking out Charmaine Tweet, it's another thing knocking out an actual world champion boxer. Though having said that, Heather Hardy was a world champion boxer when we saw her last fight. But another one that you brought up was overtraining, and overtraining I'm inclined to believe is still a massive issue in MMA. There were interviews with, I can't remember who it was. Victor Conti famously got a hold of Josh Thompson. And to be fair, if you're hiring Victor Conti, you're getting the stigma of a drug cheat. That was his whole job, so I don't know why you would hire him as like a nutritionist or whatever. But he was saying when he got a hold of Josh Thompson was 1, overtrained, and 2, almost completely dehydrated at all times. So it's interesting to think about things like this. But the other thing that I have often heard from professionals is that their coaches do not communicate with each other. So you'll go into a strength and conditioning workout or something like that with your strength and conditioning coach, and he will treat it like that's the only thing you're doing that day and expect you to be able to do that. And then you'll go later in the day and you'll be hitting pads with your pad man, and he'll be treating it like it's the only thing you're doing that day. So I can understand how overtraining would be quite common when you've got so many coaches in different disciplines and you're doing so many different disparate things. I imagine that's less of a problem at the top teams where everything's tightly regulated by a guy like Faras or Jackson and Winklejohn. But I can imagine at the lower level, or people train, like if you've got a gym with like 1 or 2 famous fighters, I can imagine that that's happening all the time. It's only when these places become big. Actually, maybe you get a diseconomies of scale effect. Maybe more success and a bigger gym leads to more disorganization between the coaches. Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out about that. I would be fascinated if there was some large study put together of MMA fighters, and if we could find out how many of them are overtraining and damaging themselves doing it. Cheers, Connor. Dear Jackiest of Slacks, thank you for finally doing fight ratings. I totally would have watched Arlovsky versus Struve. I'm so glad I at least got one person to not bother watching that. And I find it rather hard to keep up with MMA nowadays, so knowing that was a great help. Awesome. I have but one request. Could you perhaps put them in written form online somewhere, maybe on the Fight Primer? Also, who would win between Bruce Lee and McGregor, since you like pissing off fanboys? Best, Justin. P.S. Hope you had a great vacation and missed all the snow chaos. Oh no, still some snow chaos going. It's getting on my tits now. I don't know, Bruce was working hard on his wrestling by the end. But regarding the rating system, I think I will try and put it up on the Fight Primer, or I'll try and find a way of having it on the front page of Fight Primer at all times, and just keeping a big list. I actually have I worked out the averages for you so that we can compare events. I'm keeping a list of all the ratings for 2018. So, UFC 222, the average star rating, so all of them divided by the 12 fights on the card, was 2.6666, recurring, of course. It was the anniversary of Leroy Jenkins the other day. But Fight Night Werdum versus Volkov, average rating of 2.95. Now that's interesting, because I seem to remember enjoying UFC 222 more than I enjoyed Fight Night Werdum versus Volkov. But that's how that worked out. Or I've done the maths wrong. Check them yourself. But yeah, I'll find a way of putting that on the Fight Primer soon. Hi, Mr. Isaac Newton of Striking and Shooting. Oh, that's good. Long-time listener, I've heard every podcast, but I haven't read nearly as much of your work as I would like. I did buy Notorious, though. I'm sure it will be spectacular when I get round to reading it. I I'd like to ask you your opinion on fighters viewing tapes of their opponents and of their fights. It seems as though most fighters I see in interviews remark that they watch little to no tape of their opponents, preferring to leave it to their coach. There are some exceptions. Do you see this as a weakness? I know there have been some possible pitfalls like psyching oneself out or getting anticipatory. In the long run, though, I'd assume the best fighters would benefit from watching tape as long as they're of the right mindset. I don't have much to compare. As a competitive gamer, studying tape is pretty valuable, but I don't have to deal with the crushing threat of physical harm. I saw you mentioned Evo in a tweet just now. I'm going to casually mention that I've done some commentary at every Evo in hopes that that'll get my question answered. I might have even shouted you out at some point in the past, but if you read the question, I definitely will. I have no shame. Ski or Sky, which reveals that I haven't watched a lot of Evo. I think this is an interesting question. We get into the habit of talking about fighters as if they're meat, or horses or dogs or something like that. But really, that's kind of what you want. If you are a coach, it's what they want in the NFL, it's what they want in the NBA, it's what, you will have the brilliant guys like Kobe Bryant or someone like that who can think for themselves and see openings, and they become all-time greats and so on. But what you really want is like a thoroughbred human being with amazing genetic attributes or amazing athletic attributes, who can follow orders very well and train and not be bored and actually listen to what you say and fulfill your instructions under pressure. That's what you want more than like a smart fighter. You want a disciplined fighter. Now, regarding watching a film, this is always an interesting one to me because occasionally I get emails after I put up a pre-fight piece from, I'll be honest, normally from crazy Brazilians, but saying like, big fan, blah, blah, blah. But why would you put this? The specific example I'm thinking of now is Belfort versus Jones. Big fan, but why would you reveal all of Belfort's weaknesses just before his fight with Jones? He needs all the chance he can have. The thing is, like, when I write my articles like a week out from the fight tops, sometimes like 2 days out from the fight, there is no way anyone is training based on what someone's written in an article 2 days out from the fight. A fight camp is like between a few weeks and for like a massive pay-per-view boxing event or maybe a massive MMA fight, tops 3 months maybe. But in addition to all the like standard work for a fight camp, trying to get them in condition and peak at the right time, and all the nutrition and all the stuff that goes into it, learning to do anything useful is beating it into muscle memory. Like you or I could maybe do something neat against someone we'd studied really hard in the first minute of a sparring session. But as soon as you get hit or you start to get tired or something like that, that's when you're going to what you know how to do instinctively. And for most, in the case of high-level fighters, a lot of what they do instinctively might play into what the other guy likes. So if you're fighting like, well, we haven't brought up Conor McGregor this podcast, but if you're fighting Conor McGregor, Anderson Silva, Lyoto Machida, someone who thrives on the counter, and one of your main habits is to just go at them, go at your opponents, and you're a really aggressive fighter, and your coaches want you to fight differently in this fight, you're going to be forgetting that as soon as you get tired or hurt, or maybe even when you hurt them. It's by doing things, hundreds, thousands of times in training that you build them into muscle memory. And that's why it probably isn't that important that fighters watch the tape in order to train for someone. I mean, you could do it as a psychological exercise to improve their, how they're feeling about the fight, to say, look, this guy's human, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know if a fighter actually benefits that much from watching the tape. I think they probably benefit more from the coaches just finding the bits that they want to exploit and training it into them constantly. I mean, to summarize, like, the fighter is the machine. He's a piece of meat. He's a horse in the race. You treat the fighter like something that's being trained up to do something instinctually. You don't ask the fighter to look for these spots and understand everything. There isn't time to think like that in the fight. There's not time for them to be like, is now the time to do this? You want them to just go bang on the trigger, go. I think maybe after the fight, it might be important for a fighter to understand that sort of stuff. I mean, we can point to fighters who have done really, really great things and say, look, they understand the intricacies. You can see them changing from fight to fight to fight. And they, guys like Floyd Mayweather and people like that, Giorgio Petrosian, they're probably going to have more to say in their training and their strategizing for a fight. But again, that's the whole job of the coach is to take your fight and prepare you for it. It's not necessarily important that a fighter understand why he's doing something as long as he knows that the coach has seen an opportunity for it to change the fight. I mean, if a fighter wants to learn how to study tape and so on, that's an important thing to do. I know fighters who have been wild brawlers who couldn't show you something new from one fight to the next as themselves, and then they went on to be very good coaches, who then gave a really insightful analysis of the people their fighters went on to fight. It goes both ways. There are fighters who can't study film, and then there are fighters who can study film but can't put it into action. But that being said, if you give me 2 low-tier NFL players who drop out and then want to transfer over to MMA, if one of them I'm just training up like a horse for a race, to his opponent's weaknesses each time, and then the other one I'm actually trying to demonstrate the film to and teach him the finer points of this stuff, one of them's going to have a chance of being like an all-time great, and one of them's going to have a chance of being a great at that time, rather than one of the great fighters that we talk about years down the line. But, that's IMHO. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today, because we're hopefully going to be back either Thursday or Friday to talk about the upcoming fights. We're going to be spreading out the UFC 2, what are we on? 3? I don't know. We'll be spreading out the Tony versus Khabib stuff, because that card is stacked. If you're a Patreon boy, the Patreon lecture, The Hua Shogunate, just went up on the other day, and it's pretty good. Next one is going to be Tito versus Ken. I'm so looking forward to it. And yeah, sign up to that, help support the podcast, and keep me going. If you haven't bought Notorious, maybe hold off, because there's a new one coming soon. And if you haven't bookmarked the Fight Primer, do it, because that's where all my stuff ends up. If you have an email to send to the podcast, send it to fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast, rather obviously, and I will catch you later in the week. Cheers!